So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. I hope that you'll learn something from it, but also that you'll enjoy this. So, I have had a little introduction now, so I won't go into introducing myself further too much. But I would like to ask the participants if you could just pop a message into the chat to help us to get to know you as well. So just in terms of your current role and the current organization that you're involved with. And while you do that, I will just do the part of the introduction that I think wasn't touched on, but that I think is valuable in terms of just understanding my interest in this topic. So as mentioned, I did my master's on blended learning, and that to some extent was inspired by my involvement with the English department at Stellenbosch University. And what happened was that the department realized there was a need for an additional nominal hour per week, and due to restrictions that had to take place online. And so the way we kind of envisioned, getting student participation in this was really through formative assessments. And during this session, I will touch on a lot of the theory that informed how we structured that course and approached it. So while I will definitely never label myself an expert in the field, I definitely think there's always more to learn. I do feel that it's kind of worthwhile to mention that, to some extent, yes, I will be looking at theory, but it's also largely coming from practical experience. And yeah, just checking, I see a lot of people who are involved in higher education that have joined today. And I'm very kind of happy for that, because I think this is a topic that has value for anyone in the industry, but specifically when it comes to larger courses that are extended over a long period of time, there is this issue of attrition and dropout. And hopefully by the end of this workshop, you'll not only have a sense of how, this can assist with that, but also how you can practically apply that to your courses. So I will definitely at some interjections just speak to the higher education kind of context specifically. So just in terms of the aims of the workshop, I think people in our industry, deadlines are often tight, and there's always something urgent that needs our attention. And so my sense is that you don't always have the opportunity to look at theory. And so for myself, having had the opportunity to do my master's on education was very valuable in terms of engaging with what we do know. I think there's still a huge gap in research when it comes to student learning. But to some extent, I wanted to use this session just to give other people an opportunity to look at, what the theory says. And then, as mentioned, I also have practical experience with this. And so I think a big part of, transitioning from a higher education context where I was working initially to a more corporate environment has been, the opportunity to apply that theory in a variety of contexts. So hopefully some of the practical tips that I'll be sharing today, you could use in your own context. And then obviously also just to give you an opportunity to practice. So I will have a little bit of a disclaimer that I'm being overly ambitious potentially in how much I would like to cover today. But you have to kind of then excuse me if I glance over some of the less kind of practical aspects to this, since I really do want to maintain that time for activities. So I'm going to shut my camera off now, because it's always awkward to know that your floating head is on there, but I'll switch it on again at the end of the session for some questions. But since this is a workshop on formative assessments, I felt it would only be apt to start with one. So I am going to drop a link in the chat for you, and I would like you to just open this Google Sheet. So a little bit of a maybe less popular tool when it comes to assessments, but I just felt this would work really well for this particular activity. So as you're opening that, I'll just run over how this will work. So basically, this is obviously an introductory activity, so it's at this stage not based on the theory that you've been supplied with. And the intention is really to see your current thinking around formative activities. So I'm going to just move my screen over to this one, and hopefully you can see that, yes. So basically, this activity will have you placing formative assessments in a hypothetical course. So because I know we have some people who are kind of in the industry and others who are educators, I do understand that those who are not as familiar with learning experience design or instructional design might need some time to engage with the topics that you'll see just now. But no pressure in terms of that. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, but if you're only able to complete the section under week 1, then don't stress about that. As I say, it's for me to get some insight into how you currently think when it comes to formative assessments. So our hypothetical course is fully online, and as you know, is unfortunately commonly the case in this hypothetical situation, we're also not going to have manual grading. So everything would need to take place with automatic grading. But in this instance, these are formative assessments, which I think do make up quite a bulk of these sort of fully online courses that are not manually graded. And in terms of the weekly time spent for the student, we're looking at 1 to 3 hours. And your target audience would be educators with postgraduate, or educators or postgraduates with minimal experience in e-learning. So this is just some kind of contextual information, but as I say, the kind of goal here is not to focus on target audience. It's really just to see how you think about formative assessments. So in terms of what I would like you to do, each of you would have a sheet like this, and you would look at the topics and kind of think, okay, you know, hypothetically, I would like to place a formative assessment here, and then you would literally just say formative assessment, and just so that it can stand out a bit more when we discuss your submissions, if you could just make it like a light green. And that's really all at this stage. I have placed some module outcomes if you would want to look at those, but again, this is more of an informal kind of exercise. So I did receive a list of participants in advance, but from some of the names I've seen, I think we do have some people who have joined and others who are not here today. So if I could ask, if you are not listed, if you could just place your name in this row, and if you are listed, if you could just mark your name as green so that I know not to reassign your tab to someone else. So I'm just going to give you a minute to do that, and then we can start with the activity. Okay. Does anyone not have a tab assigned to them at this stage? Obviously, there are still a few people who are not currently in the session, but just in terms of those who are, I just want to make sure that everyone has a tab assigned to them at this stage. So there is a put up your hand function. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should have a little kind of profile, mic, the option to share video, and then a raise hand. So if anyone at this stage doesn't have a tab assigned to them, then you can just raise your hand. Okay, great. Then basically what you can do is if this tab is assigned to you, you can just click on that and then go to there. So to kind of show how that would work, this would bring me to my version of the tab. So if you could now go to your tab and then just add some formative assessments where you would place them. And I am going to have a 5-minute timer, but please don't feel any pressure. As I say, if you only get it through week 1, that's not an issue. I'd just rather have something for everyone to do for those who maybe do work faster. So I have added some of you who I've seen in the room, so you can look at the tab assignment if you would like to see which tab to work on. Lazal.
I'm sorry, I need to be now honest and say that I was busy with something else when the instructions were given. So I found my tab, but I'm not clear on what I need to do. So I do apologize, but I've been a typical student.
No problem at all. So all you need to do at this stage, and as I said, you don't need to do all of the modules, is just where you would naturally place a formative assessment, kind of indicate this by adding a row and then labeling it as green, just so we can see quite quickly where you would place those.
Thank you, much appreciated.
No problem. Okay, just to give you an indication, I'm going to, in 1 minute's time, we'll look at some of your proposals. Okay, and now we have the typical educator's dilemma. Do you allow people to volunteer, or do you pick on people? So I'll obviously first give you the opportunity. Is there anyone that's willing to share what they have done? A typical student kind of situation. So, Liana, unfortunately for you, your name ended up at the top. So I'm just going to go to your tab. And then if you would be so kind as to just give us a little bit of a sense, just 30 seconds, 1 minute of your thinking and what your reason was for where you placed these.
I've placed them to align with the learning objectives because the formative assessment needs to see and gauge whether the students will be able to complete the module outcomes or the learning outcomes.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a wonderful approach. Anyone else willing to? So again, tab K. Okay.
So I've started to embed the formative assessments, but I've actually got a problem because my my teaching style or my facilitation style is that I'm trying to design the learning activities that is basically both a learning opportunity and a formative assessment, because I'm very more towards having peer assessments using the group to gauge and use that. So it's very difficult for me to place a formative assessment as an official checkpoint, because my learning activities is it's integrated. I don't know if it's making sense.
No, it absolutely is, and it's definitely a lot of what I plan on sharing with the group today. So it's wonderful to know that you're already thinking in that way. And to some extent, it perhaps reinforces my claims that this is a good approach to follow.
Yeah, because it's difficult. If you look at the time spent after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, can you really ask them to do an assessment activity? Because what did they learn in 5 or 10 minutes? Maybe I shouldn't have looked at the time linked to it, but yeah, that confused me.
No, so I'll also touch on that perhaps as a sort of query as we go through the theory, because I think you're right. The way we think about these things sometimes, can influence, obviously. Liana.
In my case, I see a learning activity and a formative assessment activity as actually the same thing. Because you can, for example, if you did the key concepts in row 7, then you can have a little Kahoot or something to gauge whether they understand the key concepts. So that's a learning activity as well as a formative assessment activity. So
Again, very much speaking to kind of what the theory would tell us. Eugenie, you also have your hand up.
Yes, just a comment. I find Roselle's comment very interesting about the timing matter. For me, when I thought of placing a formative assessment after the first 4 activities, although they'd only engage in 25 minutes worth of learning, I saw it more as something that could potentially be a bit of fun for them, like maximum 5 questions, but just to check whether they were actually, let's say it was videos that they were watching, you know, whether they were attentive to what they were watching. So for me, the timing wasn't really an issue at all.
Yes, and again, that's a wonderful point. So I'm very happy to kind of get the sense that, you know, because I'm going to also speak to social learning, and I think, you know, in terms of the insights that you've shared just in this brief kind of engagement is all very valuable. And again, you know, always good to see that people, I think, you know, it comes from practice. It doesn't always come from theory, but it's wonderful to think that you have educators who their instincts are really aligned with kind of what would be suggested. Okay, so in terms of time, I already knew I was being very ambitious, but I see perhaps more so than I realized initially. So I am really just going to focus on the most important things. So with this, just I think a lot of people can recognize how important student engagement is. If a student isn't engaged in what they're learning, there's the sense of isolation, you know, it affects their performance, so graduation rates will drop. And in terms of retention, I feel as if, you know, if you take formative assessments out of the equation, it's very hard for learners to self-pace and to motivate themselves. So, you know, I believe fully in the claim that engagement is key to solving so many of our issues. In terms of what engagement is, some people see this as the learner effort. Other people see this as, you know, what the instructor does, you know, whether they're providing these opportunities to participate in enriching activities, to engage with their peers, to communicate with their instructor. And I think both definitions are valid, and formative assessments can speak to both of these. So I think, you know, often we don't think about the learner effort, and I think that is valuable, but I think the social aspect more so something that's often neglected when it comes to formative assessments. So engagement and attention, very briefly, we all know that concentration today is not what it was 10, 20 years ago. We live in an era where task switching is very common, and this brings down attention span. People have developed what they call acquired attention deficit disorder. And I would argue that this is not just something that affects the next gen student. I see a lot of even older people who, you know, just based on the kind of media that we engage with, you know, become unwilling to engage with longer sections of text. And yes, you can chunk that content, and that's definitely a very valuable practice in instructional design. But at the same time, for them to actually retain this material, you need them to interact with it and to have a chance to reflect. And I would argue, personal opinion, that having a reflection question sitting online doesn't mean that they're going to take that time to reflect. I suspect a very large percentage of learners read the question and move on, if they even read the question. So unfortunately, in terms of accountability, the instructor does need to drive that. In terms of engagement, it can also be seen as taking place on different levels. So you have the engagement with the instructor, you have the engagement with the content, and then you have the engagement with peers. And I believe that all of these are important in terms of creating, you know, fostering a truly engaging learning experience. But instructors do have some responsibility in creating these opportunities for different forms of engagement. And I know that particularly in the higher education space, instructors are often quite thinly spread. And so I would argue that there is even room within formative assessments to have that teacher presence in terms of how you present things, how much learning support you provide, how you frame feedback. And obviously, peer graded assessments, group work, these are also things that can really drive engagement, but they often sit in summative assessments. But at the same time, it ends up being a case of what do you define as summative and formative. So definitely some peer assessed and group work activities are formative. It's just the weighting of grades that I sometimes worry about, the implications that has for learner anxiety, or how positive the experience actually is. Then this is very briefly kind of these suggestions, for people who are new to online learning or have perhaps had a quite formulaic approach in the past, and what's really important. And I just brought this in because I'd like to argue that a lot of this can actually take place through formative assessments. You can have variety. You're obviously going to be encouraging active engagement and practice, and even personalization, because you do have the option of presenting an assessment and saying, those students who perform well on this will follow this learner path, where those who don't will require additional learning. So just, part of this rethinking formative assessments and, not being too formulaic in how we approach it, and thinking about how it touches on other aspects of the online learning experience. So in terms of rethinking formative assessments, let me just see this message. And of course, it's very confusing to have my mouse in two spaces. So group work, strategies to ensure that it's fair and equally. Yeah, definitely a pet peeve of many students, and unfortunately particularly high-performing students who might feel that group work actually brings down their grades. So yes, it is very important to monitor input and contribution. So just back to this idea of formative assessment, we all know it's assessment for learning. And when we look at it at a surface level, it can be formal or informal. It's always placed within the learning process, not at the end. And the goal really is to improve student performance. But I think there is a risk of being formulaic. There's a risk of, as I say, not thinking about how it ties in with the kind of broader learner experience. Then just, in terms of engagement, the type of activity influences how much information is retained, and good activities develop deep understanding. So I think part of rethinking formative assessments is also thinking about novel ways in which this can be done, and avoiding situations where there's the option to be mindless when completing these. So the testing effect, I don't know, to what extent people are formally familiar with this, but I have a strong feeling that anyone that's been involved with formal education has had multiple occasions where students ask, is this going to be on the test? And quite simply, there is that part of learning where students learn for grades. If they know something will be in an exam, etc., then they'll study it. Unfortunately, not always as well as we would like. But in addition to this, there is a cognitive element to the testing effect. So when you retrieve information, and I just placed this here to show, already in 1620, this was verbalized. It was probably already known before that. So I'd love for there to be more studies on this, and there are studies, but they are too context specific sometimes to really, measure. And this particular study was, took place in a science context. The learners were given, quite sectioned, chunked content, so one section of content and then being tested. But I think what's valuable here is first off just seeing the huge difference that retrieval practice can make, but then also the fact that concept mapping is an active learning task and it does show effects, but there is that influence of tasting that's got a slightly higher accountability, and I think that's a big part of why you see the tasting effect. Oh, wonderful. Thanks for also sharing. I'll have a little look at that myself, because you will see that I'm kind of more positive about kind of peer interaction in the online space than maybe I used to be. But just getting back to this, there's really two strong elements to the tasting effect and how you can strengthen that. The one is feedback. I'll speak more to this a little bit later, but retrievability as well. I'm a strong believer that placing the information a student needs close to the assessment is valuable. The moment you expect someone to break their learning path, to go back to something they saw the previous week, etc., unfortunately, learners are often lazy, and you're most likely going to see worse results if you rely on that. You can definitely just add a revisionary thing. And I would also argue that you can integrate the learning into the assessment. So if you need to do some sort of revision, place that in the activity itself. So just, kind of touching on, and I think most people are very familiar with this, just what is available to educators when it comes to auto and peer graded assessments. And in terms of that, I know, for example, the University of Pretoria uses Blackboard, and the peer assessment there is great. I think on Moodle, the better option in terms of just the complexity of the workshop activity would be graded forums. So unfortunately, I think currently a lot of systems don't speak to peer assessment, and I'm hoping that'll improve. But I think in terms of those situations where you can't rely too strongly on that, and definitely there's a huge time implication for adding peer-assessed activities. Tests and quizzes is another area where I think it's so valuable to rethink how we treat these. So then just a matter on testing frequency. There is sometimes the question, should you have equally spaced out, so at the end of each week, etc. And then on the other hand, is there any difference if it's kind of expanded and not structured? So personally, I believe in the value of structure, especially in huge groups. If a learner knows, this is when I will be tested, you're most likely going to have fewer student queries, and because they know they'll be tested, you're going to be kind of benefiting from that tasting effect. But on the other hand, that approach of linking it to the learning outcomes is as important. So I feel as if frequency of tasting can help to build persistence and to just maintain student engagement, but at the same time, where possible, it is valuable to link that to those core outcomes. Estimating time allocation, so just, in terms of those cases where you do have nominal hours and it's attached to, the NQF level, etc. This is just to give you a sense. I think sometimes we overestimate how long students need to answer something like a multiple choice question. As mentioned, peer assessment does push up your timings a bit, because you do need to then keep in mind how long it'll take their peer to actually read what they've submitted, and then for them to read the feedback. And also instructor feedback, just good to have kind of a sense of how long people take to read. So not something that you need to maybe note down, but if you are working in a space where this is important, it's just good to kind of do that research beforehand. Now, the second activity. So the second activity is basically returning to the worksheets that you were using, and you'll see that if you click above H, you'll find some assessment types. So, don't know why it's doing that. So where, and you could also add additional ones if you kind of want to change where you initially placed them. But just kind of looking at these, thinking about how much value they would have for the student and the time estimate. So as mentioned, I know that, you know, the flexibility of 1 to 3 hours for a course isn't common, but it's really just in terms of allowing you some freedom to play around with this. So you'll be working on the same tab that, bye Yana. You'll be working on the same tab that was initially assigned to you, and then I'm going to just make this 5 minutes so I can maybe give you a 5-minute break after. So I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes, then I'll let you know when 5 minutes have passed, and then those who do just quickly want to take a short breather, I'll then kind of, yes, Liana, I'll definitely provide that, actually, since I'm kind of rushing through some of it. So any questions in terms of how to complete this? So basically just copying and pasting once you've opened this, copying and pasting these into these slots or any additional slots you might want to add. Okay, then I'm going to start the timer, but you can shout if you have any questions. Okay, so as mentioned, if anyone does just want to take a 5-minute breather, we'll reconvene at 2. Those who don't feel the need, you're welcome to continue with the activity. But we'll work through kind of conversations around that at 2 p.m. Okay, I'm hoping everyone's back. And I'm again hoping that we'll have someone who is perhaps willing to volunteer to share what they've done and their reasoning behind this with us. So Do we have any volunteers? Elise, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think mine still needs a lot of work, but what I was just thinking is just according to the model outcomes that I looked at, and because of the minutes, seeing that it's a very short time, I went for very simple type of things. And then because there's an explanation, one of the model outcomes was explaining, I thought that could be quite a peer assessed forum kind of thing where they can help each other explain it. And then I went down to peer assessed forum again, like a revision here at the end, before I thought like maybe an individual assessment. That not everything is, that was my summative assessment right here at the end.
Yeah, so definitely I think it's a valuable insight there to say, you know, when you're dealing with a short section of text, okay, we're keeping in mind that attention span is dwindling, and that there is this tasting effect. So if people know that they're going to be assessed on something, they're going to concentrate better and retain more. But definitely when you're dealing with this, a simple kind of multiple choice question is just going to, you know, suit that better than something that is complex. And in terms of, you know, I'm also very positive about seeing how you've indicated feedback for all of that, because I will touch on that in a bit. So definitely, and again, also very positive about the fact that you've considered the learning outcomes, because we do have limitations in terms of how well we can speak to higher order thinking when it comes to auto-assessed assessment types. Do we have another volunteer? Catherine.
Oh, I thought let me just jump in, get it over with. So I'm tab J over there. I'll do module 1 as well because I didn't get too far with the rest. And I was also focusing on the module outcomes there. So the first one that involves the student having to list the tasks associated with the different roles in the industry. I made that a matching activity so that they could match the tasks with the different roles. The next one was a bit of a longer section, so 14 minutes in total there. And because they just had to identify the key theories, I just made that an MCQ with feedback. I don't believe in MCQs without feedback. And then the design thinking, because they had to explain the relationship there, I also decided to use a peer assessment forum for that one. And then the ADDIE tasks, I did a sorting activity where they again had to drag and drop the key tasks to the various stages of the model.
Wonderful. So I think something that, you know, is valuable that we can learn from your approach here is how the assessment type can also speak to the content. So in terms of where you've placed the matching activity, one of the kind of negatives, and it's not something that you can't work around, but I just generally find in terms of a matching activity, it doesn't necessarily lend itself as much to incorporating the learning into that so that you teach as part of the assessment, and the feedback for this is often not as you know, it doesn't typically explore concepts further. And so that's where it is very valuable to limit the use of these to those instances where it's recall. Yes, you want them to understand the roles, and so the way you formulate your descriptions in a matching activity there can be valuable. But when it comes to, you know, explaining relationships, etc., then a matching activity is not going to work as well. Do we have anyone else who'd like to share their thinking? Millie, can I be horrible and ask you?
I think I followed similar approach to the previous speakers, where the type of content sort of led me to identify the type of activity, like the key activities. I think the sorting activity can work well there. And then the last one for module 1, the formative assessment. And there I think a peer assessment can work well, because the design thinking, as you explained now, design thinking can be very broad, and to integrate it with the ADDIE model, I think that would, in my view, be a good activity to use.
Yeah, definitely. I do think, you know, in terms of this is a hypothetical course. You don't have the content in front of you. And so, you know, we could make assumptions about how these things will be approached. And I think from what I've seen, you've been quite able to kind of, you know, identify that these are simpler things. These are things that, you know, if they touch this on a surface level, they'll be able to kind of, you know, it's not that they should just know. I know we never use terms like know or understand when we're compiling objectives, but I think, you know, in the back of our minds, we often know that certain things the student just needs to know. They don't need to. They're never going to list this or that in practice. And so I think definitely, you know, simpler activities like a drag and drop would function quite well for something like key tasks. The complex multiple choice with feedback, I'm also very positive about seeing that, because you're feeding into the design thinking that is going to be looked at again at the end of the course. And so by encouraging the student at that stage already to engage with it on a bit of a deeper level, obviously there is going to be a value add there. And again, if you're looking at what you really want the learner to take out of this, then I do think there's always value from complex multiple choice questions when it comes to those core outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my kind of theory here. So getting the most out of formative assessments, I think to some extent we've spoken just by looking at your examples. You can see how the type of assessment you use, where you place this, feedback, all of these things, you know, play a role. And it's often difficult in terms of formal academic research, you know, to really pinpoint these things and show their results. But I think when, you know, in practice, you can see that. And we have this kind of sense, it's always taught, you know, in formal kind of educator training, that they'll say formative assessments should also give the educator an indication of their performance. And I think we don't do that often enough. And that's why I'm so glad to see the strong instincts in this group in terms of how to get the most out of formative assessments. But I think improving on that does to some extent require of us to look at how our students are performing and to then revisit what we've done if we're not seeing what we want to see. Now, the influence of grading. The reason most educators have students asking them whether this will be in an exam is because grading matters. However, in formal education, it's not always viable to put a lot of weight on assessments. So in terms of this, there is value in pointing out to the student, you know, that I definitely think there should be some grade attached to it. But if it's low stakes, you know, on the one hand, you have the positive, it's aiding in their confidence, but on the other hand, some people will not apply themselves as much if it has a low impact on grading. And that's where it's so valuable to sometimes point out to the learner why, you know, they're doing these assessments and how it will benefit them. And I believe that that's also a space where, you know, you can get some of your instructor presence, because these are the instances where you show empathy and you connect with the learner. On the other hand, it's also valuable to note that students are most motivated by moderately challenging tasks. So while there is some value in just testing pure recall, there's also value in thinking of ways of really just placing it in that zone of proximal development, just really moving into that next space for them, because, you know, it is suggested that students actually respond positively to this. Okay, and then feedback. Again, I was very positive about all of the participants saying, you know, they don't believe in any kind of assessment without feedback. What is interesting, and I think in my personal experience, I most often see feedback being placed directly after an assessment has taken place. And so it is interesting to note that it suggested that delayed feedback actually has greater value. And just in terms of the practical kind of application of this insight, we often, when we're setting up something like a multiple choice quiz, you know, you build that feedback into the tool and the tool encourages you to do that. Something like Moodle, you have the option of saying that students can only see their feedback at a later stage, but I often question whether students would actually go back and check that. So I think having it sit as a separate resource where you have the questions and answer options appearing again and you're indicating the correct response there, it becomes revisionary, but you've also had kind of this this sense where if they have given an incorrect response, the emotional kind of thing with feedback is less, because they have been spaced from that initial performance if they didn't perform that well. Then in terms of feedback informative assessment, I think, you know, this is something that some people can kind of look to seeing how they can add this to their courses. Is formative assessments are supposed to be looking back and preparing forward. And so in terms of that, if the kind of content allows for it, I think it is valuable in feedback to also point to how this is going to relate to the next topic. So including that content through, you know, some teaching within the assessment itself, and then also in the feedback, kind of feeding and kind of bridging with your next content. I think that is just something that is not done that often at the moment, and I think that there is value in that. Obviously, feedback has to be constructive. There's this aspect to which formative assessments can lower anxiety, and I don't think that's the case if feedback is quite harsh. And then there's also an aspect where certain types of feedback can help develop students' capacity to self-assess. So something like a marking rubric is just going to encourage a deeper engagement with their own work or with the peers' work. And I will say here that I think that when you use a rubric in peer assessment, even though the task at that stage is to assess the peer, the student then also has this opportunity to think about how this applies to their own performance. So even though I don't have the space in this session to really go into that, I think it's a space where if educators want to improve on this aspect to their teaching, compiling meaningful feedback rubrics can really be valuable. So for the next activity, I actually ended up changing it. So I see I haven't updated my presentation in that sense, but I'm also going to have to just look at the admin around this, since we have had some participants drop out. So we're going to return to this worksheet, and I'm just going to ask those who are still active to just mark their cell green, so that I can then just assign a marker to you. So I'm just going to give you a minute to quickly indicate if you are still with us. Okay, does anyone at this stage not have someone assigned to them on this side? Okay, so assuming you do, then you can just go to the sheet assigned to you, and if you click above L, you'll see that you kind of can just give a grade here. Apologies for this. So you can just give a grade based on what you've learned now, and then write down just briefly a positive, and then some room for improvement. So in terms of this, you're obviously not going to have much time to go through it, and obviously we have also spoken to some positives, but just if you do feel that you can kind of give a value add based on your interpretation, as I say, because I haven't now provided a rubric, it's really very informal, but it's just kind of to draw attention to, you know, how you know, the peer assessment really relies on the student's own learning. And then to also see, you know, in terms of applying what we've discussed today, if you can kind of, from that, make some suggestions for improvement on your peers' work. So as I say, just in terms of going to the tab assigned here, and do shout if you don't have one assigned. And I'm going to, I think, just give 3 minutes for this, since I'm hoping that, you know, it is quite a surface level activity at this stage.
Millie?
Yes.
Sorry, Francie, could I ask, once I'm in the tab assigned to me, to what column must I go?
So
I go to J, yes, and then
here, if you scroll along at L.
L. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay. So in terms of this, as I mentioned, it is perhaps a bit of a surface level activity, but I do think, you know, that technology, that it is valuable to sometimes experience what we ask of our learners. So in terms of that, I think, you know, we very rarely as educators peer assess others. So I see, I don't know if anyone has been able to complete it. So I can just kind of, yeah, so here, you know, wonderful, mentioning the positive type of assessments appears to match outcomes and assumed type of content well. And then the long section end may be a lot for learners to deal with, can potentially be divided into 2 formative assessments. So wonderful feedback, especially, you know, given the time constraints that you did have. So I just think that, you know, it is something where it doesn't need to take a lot of time to peer assess, but it's valuable to see how, you know, the learner needs to have the knowledge to be able to peer assess. And, you know, there was previous mention about fairness, and definitely someone can only be assessed fairly if the peer is familiar with this. And that's why, you know, having this function at a bit of a surface level, you know, just due to the constraints of the workshop, is definitely, you know, not ideal, but hopefully still, you know, experiential exposure to that idea. So this kind of knowing where you're going kind of concept is really related to the fact that, yes, I definitely think formative assessments are valuable for engagement and sustaining interaction in the course. But it is also valuable to note that if learners know what their summative assessments are going to be, you will kind of have a little bit of a different student experience, and it will impact on where you place your formative assessments and how many of these you need to include. So in terms of that, let's see, E is Elise. So I did find it very interesting that Elise included a summative assessment. And that definitely speaks to also knowing the value of that. If I were to have summative assessments in my course, and these are activities that are requiring a level of interaction that is going to drive the student to engage with the content on a deeper level, that would impact where I'm going to place activities and how many of these I'm going to include. So I definitely think that it's very valuable for educators to sometimes expose themselves to online courses. And I have just found it interesting how the difference that it makes when you don't have formative assessments, for example, and the difference it makes when you have quite challenging summative assessments. So I do think that it is valuable to note that there are these factors that will have an impact, whether the learner is interested in the content, if it relates quite strongly to their future goals, and also just the amount of kind of retention through revision that you encourage. All of these things will impact knowledge retention. And I think in the higher education context, we are sometimes placed in a position where you need to teach a subject to a student, and it's not their main kind of focus. It might not be what they want to specialize in. And that is where, when you're dealing with these kind of things, you don't always have the benefit of their personal interest and relevance to their future goals. And that's where there is that power to summative assessment, because as I say, learners are unfortunately very invested in that. So the last thing I want to touch on is just how we think about the tools available to us when it comes to higher order thinking. And I'm hoping that, again, I think it's going to unfortunately be quite a surface level engagement, but most educators will be quite familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. And when you're creating a multiple choice sort of question, it's so easy to do so for just recalling facts or understanding or even application. But when you start moving into analysis, evaluation, and creation, I think that is really where it becomes difficult. And as such, I think that's also a part of where we need to rethink formative assessments, because especially in a context where you can't place too much marking on your facilitator, which is often the case with fully online courses, there is that need to speak to higher order thinking. So some suggestions in terms of this, and I know that very often these are already used for application, but the moment you want analysis, yes, you can kind of just have them speak to the theory and compare theory, but justification becomes more important. Answer options that are distinguished through the reason why you would make a claim becomes more important. And then it is difficult to kind of speak to creation when it comes to quiz sort of questions. So in terms of that, that is really where peer assessment is most valuable. And to some extent, I would also say to reserve peer assessment for those instances where you need to speak to those kinds of objectives. So I see my developer added that twice. So in terms of the fourth activity, I would like to, kind of see to what extent you could come up with a multiple choice question that speaks to higher order thinking. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat here to just a drive folder where you will also find a copy of the presentation if you'd be interested in downloading that afterwards. But in that folder, you'll see that there is an infographic entitled Gagner's 9 Events of Instruction. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes to complete this activity. And where you will do this is on Mural. So it does take a while to load. So I would suggest opening this in a browser window kind of first and then looking at the infographic perhaps. But just based on the participation numbers, I am going to ask you, and it might just be valuable to give a little bit of a sense with Mural because it is a bit of a strange tool. So if you click, you would move around, and to kind of go into this area where you'll be placing your question text, etc. You'll hold in Shift to zoom in on that. I am, while you just look at the infographic and kind of start thinking about potential ways in which you could, look at those higher order thinking skills. I'm going to just place the participants' names on here so that you can see which column is assigned to you. And then I will go back to the Bloom's taxonomy slide just so that you can also have that as a reference if you'd like to. So I will start the 15-minute timer once I've done my admin, just because I know that when it comes to more complex questions, it does take a while to really think through that. Okay, so I'm going to start the timer now. Please feel free to ask if you have any questions. And especially since I know mural is probably new to some of you. And then once you're done, if you could put up your hand just to indicate this, so that if you finish early, then we can move on earlier. But definitely, as I say, I do understand that these sort of questions generally require a bit more input and time to create. Okay, so I do realize that the time for this activity was quite limited, so there will not be any harsh judgment on what you were able to create in this time. But I am going to just look at some of the questions, because I think, you know, to some extent that already will give one an indication of at what level this was pitched. So Elise has a question. The lecturer shows a video on dog behavior. She uses H5P to add questions to the video and provide a link to extra resources. Which event of instruction would this be? And then to supply a reason as well. Definitely, you know, one of these that is taking it just that little bit above application. And I think application is so important because it feeds into all of your higher order thinking skills. So I think that's a great one, Elise. Liana, which of the following learning outcomes adheres to all the required elements? Communicating effectively, understanding. So I'm thinking with this one, or do you mean like the elements of Gagne's overall kind of goal, or is this kind of just the sort of question that you would pitch, you know, in terms of maybe a course on professional communication?
Sorry,
Yeah,
I was looking for the unmute button. Now, this is all. This is an example. I don't know if I understood it wrongly. It's just an example of a question to gauge the students. What's the level? To evaluate learning objectives. When you write a learning objective, you have to apply the SMART principles. It must be specific. It must be measurable. And all those things. So that my idea was providing them with different learning outcomes, and I must say which one is a properly phrased learning outcome.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a wonderful example of how, you know, it's not a text-heavy question, and the learner would probably be able to answer a question like this in 2 to 3 minutes. So definitely, you know, as I say, application is such a big part of moving on to evaluation. So just because I have definitely been overly ambitious with my time, I'm going to pop a link into the chat now. And this is to some extent a feedback sheet. I kind of already know, you know, in terms of this topic, it really is something that could be broken up into more sessions. Although I do think all the aspects really speak to each other. So it is an opportunity for you to, you know, also provide feedback and maybe suggest some of what you've looked at on this topic that you think if this were to be added, it would be a value add for participants. But the second part of this isn't, if you really just want to kind of go to that, I'm quickly just going to share so that you can see kind of where that would lie. So if you didn't really want to give the feedback, but you'd be interested in this offer, you could just add your email, and then let me quickly do this so that it will allow me to move on. Then TTRO is an accredited provider of articulate training. And if any of you would be interested, then you could indicate as such here, and then you could be added to one of our February or March sessions. So we have 2 seats available, and the training is on articulate rise and articulate storyline. So you'll see that I did drop a link there if you want to just kind of learn more about what that entails. And then you could also do a little bit of research on articulate rise and storyline. Definitely 2 tools that are becoming increasingly popular, or it already has been with Storyline, but Rise is just increasing in popularity as well. And, you know, as I said, I think doing online training in and of itself is so valuable to anyone who works in online learning. So definitely would love for some of you to potentially join for those sessions. And as I said, it is accredited, so you will at least walk away with a certificate that you can kind of add to your LinkedIn. So just to kind of wrap up, because so it's going the wrong way. So I have, if you go to the link where the infographic was sitting, then you'll see there is a copy of this presentation. So I have some examples of questions that would speak to just the lower level and then the higher level thinking. And I think one of the most challenging things always is create. It is incredibly difficult to create multiple choice questions that speak to this, and this is one of those places where I would suggest, you know, if you can do peer assessed activities, then definitely when it comes to creation, that is your best option. But I thought I would pose to myself the challenge of trying to do something that would at least, you know, speak to that. And so my suggestion here would be that you have an activity that asks the student to create a learner path. You have them submit this on the platform so that there is accountability. And once they have done that, I would unlock the multiple choice question. So in terms of that, you know, the weight that one would like to tie to those higher order thinking skills, I don't think, you know, that multiple choice really speaks to it. But if you are in a situation where, you know, your options are limited, I did just think that these are the sort of kind of, you know, thing one could do, and I think it takes a little bit of out of the box thinking. Now, I do realize that I have 2 minutes left. And we can carry over a little bit if anyone does have any questions. Otherwise, you're welcome to pop me an email if you just want to continue the discussion. I could talk about this topic for days on end, so I'll put my email in there if you did want to reach out. Also, you can use the feedback form for that if you'd like. But I did just think I'll quickly ask if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask at this stage.
Does not look like it. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, it's good in terms of being able to then let you go and live your lives. But as I said, I hope that, you know, that you will take something away from this. I'm very grateful to those of you who joined, because I think it's been valuable for me to also get a sense of the extent to which those working in my industry already have these insights, and could potentially maybe also share those insights with some of their colleagues. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, Millie. We appreciate your session with us today. And just to remind everyone again, I hope that we see you at the closing session at 4:10, where we will announce the lucky draw winners from Kumo Space.